warmly welcome you and encourage you to contribute questions and comments online, because our colleagues from the Information Services team are keeping track of that. It is really a great pleasure to kick off, to welcome you to the first in the series of IIEP Strategic Debates for 2018. How many of you were for a strategic debate last year? Okay, so we have some returnees. I'm glad to hear. So this year we chose the theme, Meeting SDG 4's Learning Objectives, Looking Beyond the Obvious. So as you know, there's a lot of international discourse about assessments, et cetera, but we wanted to look at some of the other issues that are not so commonly examined. So there is widespread recognition that we have a global learning crisis with millions of children and youth that are unable to master basic skills in numeracy and literacy. But what's less clear is, what do children need to learn in a fast-paced world? How can we foster all-inclusive education that is of quality and this rapidly changing future that our youth are facing? So in pursuit of SDG 4, we need to look beyond the obvious and to debate some new ideas and strategies that will ultimately redefine learning while ensuring opportunity for all. So this is what's the idea behind our theme for this year. And it's really a great pleasure. I'm not going to introduce the speakers. I'm going to leave that to my colleague Hugues Moussy. But let me just say that we're here this first seminar we have organized to focus on social and emotional skills as they relate to the Education 2030 agenda. So it is a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Hugues Moussy, who leads our research and development team here in IIEP Paris. May I pass it to you, Hugues?
Yeah, thank you, Sue, and good afternoon to everyone. I don't think there's a need to further highlight the importance of the topic we're going to discuss today with our intervenants and our speakers. So let me go directly to introducing them. First of all, I have the pleasure to introduce Dirk van Damme, who is currently head of the Skills Beyond School Division at the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills. Dirk is also a professor of educational sciences at Ghent University and a visiting professor or part-time professor in various universities, including the Free University of Brussels and Staten Hall University in New Jersey in the United States. He holds various positions in the education sector in Belgium, and he especially was the chief of staff of the the Flemish Ministry of Education from 2004 up to 2008. His current interests are evidence-based innovation in education, comparative analysis of educational systems, new developments in the learning sciences, and knowledge management in education. I hope that this describes what you've done and what you do. I also have the pleasure to introduce Carmel Gallagher. Do I pronounce it well?
Yes.
Carmel is a senior fellow and special advisor to the International Bureau of Education that we know well at IIEP, which is part of the UNESCO family. She is supporting the director in the development of competence-based curriculum and assessment for their implementation. And she also represents IB, the International Bureau of Education, is Education 2030 project, right? She has a policy making, especially in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. It's designed, developed, and implemented this curriculum back to 2007. And I quote, this newly revised curriculum was one of the first curricula in the world to make explicit statutory cross-curricular provision for the development of pupils' thinking skills, including social and emotional development. She was also an advisor in various international agencies, including the World Bank, British Council, and the Council of Europe on curriculum development. So she's now more interested in conceptualization of flexible competence-based curricula, progression in competencies and their assessment, and the conceptualization of teacher competencies at classroom, middle management, and senior management levels. So Dirk and Carmel, IIEP is much honored to have you both here today and to get a chance to listen to you and learn from your vast knowledge, but also policy experiences on the topic of social and emotional skills. So without waiting, Dirk, the floor is yours for about 40 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, I hope this works.
I hope it does.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be here at IIEP. We are actually neighbors. OECD headquarters is just a few streets away from, but we don't have interaction enough. So I'm happy to be the one who is facilitating collaboration between our two very interesting organizations. If I am still in the camera, I will move out of this picture. I prefer to stand when I speak. I'm a university teacher, so I like to be a bit more lively, and otherwise people in the back have difficulties in seeing me. A fascinating topic indeed this afternoon. Thank you, Sue, for mentioning it and starting this discussion. Social emotional skills is very much in the international educational debate and policy reflection. Still, there are so many uncertainties and discussions, and these discussions are needed. And I will be able to demonstrate to you that not everything is clear yet. There are a lot of question marks in this area, but there is a growing awareness that we are here touching upon a very important aspect of education and learning. Oops. Yeah. Okay. Starting from the SDG 4 goal, there are a couple of targets where there is some entry into the content and the substance of learning and education. Not so much. I personally would have wanted more of them, but here and there are some hooks to which we can hang on this debate about what should young people, children, adults all over the world, what should they learn? And especially in Target 4.1, there is this use of the notion of relevant learning, effective learning outcomes, but relevant is what is of interest to me here. Also in Target 4.4, and in the text which accompanies the targets, you even find high-level cognitive and non-cognitive / transferable skills. When I first read it, I said, yeah, what do they mean, actually? What is that supposed to mean? And of course, in such language, there is always a lot of ambiguity, but I think the task of the international community is now to develop the thinking and the reflection and also the research and the policy action on these terms. And of course, in Target 4.7, which is a very important one and a very dear one to many people, you also have some references. The knowledge and skills needed to, and I will not read at all, you know that very well, but all these beautiful social and political objectives. But what are the knowledge and what are the skills? What is the cognitive and non-cognitive aspect, which is mentioned again of learning, which is supposed to contribute to these beautiful objectives? So that's actually the starting point. That are the question marks that I want to raise in the beginning of my talk. I think we all in the international community working on education are very proud and very honored to have such a beautiful SDG goal and the targets. moving the agenda to the quality of education, to relevance of education, to learning, instead of only looking at educational provision. And it broadens also the framework of what, as I said, what children should learn. Not only children, all learners, young people, adults, etc. So what the question mark is, what do we mean by relevant? What do we mean when we say both cognitive and non-cognitive? But before starting to answer that question, let me take a step back. Because why has this topic come into the field and into the international debate? And I believe personally that some work of the OECD has been instrumental in this. We have been working on this since 2012 approximately. And the first project on which we embarked to explore these issues was called Education and Social Progress, the ESP project. And what we try to investigate is how can we understand that education has such an important role, not only in employability and wages and economic returns on investment and all these kind of things that have been dominating the debate before, but on all kinds of so-called non-economic outcomes of education. And let me give a few examples. I could give you an endless list of slides on these topics, but actually the message is every time just the same. But there is an important gradient, for example, in health. Self-assessed health or more objective measures of health doesn't produce a lot of difference, but more educated people are more healthy. Even after controlling for income, for housing, for work, all kinds of background variables. If you control for them, the relationship still stands. More education leads to more health. Oops. And I can take other kinds of so-called non-economic outcomes. Interesting example, interpersonal trust, which is a very important indicator that we are increasingly using in these debates about social progress. Interpersonal trust is a very important ingredient of social cohesion, of quality of living in societies, etc. And again, we find the same relationship. There are differences among countries, but there are not so big differences in the education gradient, in the difference between educational attainment levels in these indicators. More educated people tend to trust another person more frequently, more deeply. And I can, as I said, give you many other examples. Volunteering, tolerance, civic and political engagement, attitudes towards migrants, etc., etc. Again and again, we find more educated people tend to be more tolerant, more respectful towards migrants, tend to engage themselves more in social life and in volunteering, etc., etc. So the big question is, how should we understand this relationship? What does it mean? Apparently, people learn something. Yeah, it would be very bad if they don't learn anything in school, but apparently people learn something in formal educational contexts which allow them to produce these positive, or as we perceive them as positive, social outcomes. There has been a lot of research on these issues, for example, on health. We know that some cognitive aspects contribute to better health. If you know that alcohol or smoking is bad, there is some chance that you adopt your behavior. But current research is actually much more interested in what is called the non-cognitive dimension. And that opens the door to the social and emotional skills. I actually hate the term non-cognitive. I hate any negative term, also non-economic, because it's just saying nothing. It's excluding part of the debate, but it's saying nothing positive about the rest of the debate. So I use non-cognitive between, how do you say that? between brackets or between, yeah. Just to say that for ease of use or convenience, it's useful to use the term, but actually it's a very bad term. In general, we can explain a lot of the variation in a broad range of outcomes, economic outcomes, social outcomes, by looking at cognitive skills. And of course, in the OECD, we have done a lot of work on these issues. We have mostly worked on cognitive foundation skills, literacy, numeracy, etc. Although I would say that no literacy, no numeracy is purely cognitive. You should not see, but I'm coming back to this issue, cognitive and non-cognitive as excluding categories. There is a lot of interaction between the two, but that's something else. But if we try to pull them apart, the relationship between cognitive and various measures of economic and social outcomes is there, but it's not always very strong. It's not always completely convincing. For example, interpersonal trust, again, there is a relationship with cognitive learning outcomes, but it explains only a part of the variance. What we did in the ESP project is then collecting all kinds of existing evidence, longitudinal databases, existing research, and we tried to develop a methodology which could be used on a broad range of databases, existing databases, in order to come to reliable measures of the impact of cognitive and social and emotional skills. I give you a few examples, but I don't think it's bad to make a little bit of propaganda while I'm here. If you're interested, there are two books which you should really read, on which this research is based. The first one was Improving Health and Social Cohesion Through Education, I think published in 2013, 14, something like that. And then in 2015, our main report, Skills for Social Progress. That was actually the groundwork, and the couple of slides that I'm showing now come from this publication. I'll give you a couple of examples, but there are many more. If you look at obesity, for example, as I said, cognitive in Norway, a little bit also in the US, very much little in the UK. I don't know why. Maybe I have to say very clearly, the differences between countries is not what interests me. And I will also say again at the end, when we try to move the measurement agenda, it's not to rank countries. It's not even to compare countries. It's to understand relationships. I want to make that very clear. Yeah? So the difference between countries is actually not very important. If you find the same relationship in different kind of cultural contexts, then you have more certainty that it has some meaning, that it has some significance. But cognitive explains only very little why people are becoming obese. And you know that obesity is the big health risk for the 21st century, not only in the developed world, increasingly in emerging countries, increasingly in developing countries. So social and emotional skills seem to be much more powerful. And this is not based on correlations. The charts that I show you are not correlations. They are longitudinal data, or sometimes also quasi-experimental design. So it's actually strong evidence. The same for more kind of antisocial behavior, delinquency, bullying. The exact topics differ because we use different databases. But for example, on delinquency, you see the huge impact of social emotional skills. On bullying, there is actually very little relationship with cognitive. Antisocial behavior, the same. So again, there are differences between countries, but that's not of interest here. The importance is comparing as well as possible the cognitive and social emotional skills. Now, I will not explain the methodology behind these charts. It's quite complicated. As I said, they are not correlations, they are quasi experimental. So if you move people on the cognitive dimension, the horizontal axis, what is happening with the dependent variable? In this case, college completion. If you move them on the cognitive side, you see improvement, of course. People have a high chance of finish their college in the United States. If you move social and emotional skills, the relationship goes much higher, actually stronger. There is a lot of parallel between the two, but finishing college in the United States has more to do with some social and emotional skills. And in this case, what we found was self-esteem being very important, locus of control. And I'm coming back to that because there are important sub-dimensions of conscientiousness. Locus of control is actually a very important and powerful topic. And we know that also from the literature on development, even from the 50s and the 60s, for example, in demography and family planning. Why do some women take anti-conception? Why do others not take anti-conception? And there are a lot of social variables. There is religion, there is modernity, etc. But the personal factor that matters is locus of control. If you see your own body as something that you can master yourself, that you control yourself, that you can improve, then you are more frequently using anti-conception. We know that from old literature, but we now see that also in all kinds of other relationships. Locus of control, remember that because that's a very important variable. Another, unemployment. Even so, I'm using a few examples of economic outcomes just to say or to demonstrate to you that actually the difference between social and economic outcomes might be important, and it's important to widen debate away from employability and only looking at economic outcomes, but actually the relationships are not fundamentally different. Improving the cognitive skills of people, in this case in the UK, lowers the probability of being unemployed at age 26. But improving the social and emotional skills has the same power. And again, it's about self-esteem, it's about locus of control, but also about persistence. And this is, of course, very much what employers say. Employers say, we have difficulties in recruiting people, and if we have huge difficulties sometimes with the behavior of young people, they don't come on time, they don't persist, they are easily demotivated, etc., etc. All this kind of cheap rhetoric that you often hear in educational debates, but it has some ground, it has some meaning. This comes from a very important review study where the author, it's not OECD work, the author integrated hundreds of specific research articles and tried to measure the effect sizes found in all these empirical studies. And of course, intelligence has a role, parental income, social background has a role, in this case in occupation, in employment and wages. SES has a role, but social economic skills, see how powerful they are. So this is, again, a very powerful thing. Now I come to a few examples of where cognitive and non-cognitive, to use that term again, social emotional, diverges. If we look more at well-being indicators, the relationships become different. This case, a database from New Zealand. If you improve the cognitive skills of young people at age 20, doesn't make any difference in self-reported happiness. But if you improve social emotional skills, the relationship is there. And in this case, it's again about perseverance, conscientiousness, responsibility, and communication skills. And this slide is a bit more complicated, but very interesting. And I'm coming back to the issue of cognitive, non-cognitive, not always able to distinguish them very carefully because there are a lot of interactions. And in this case, there's a clear example of an interaction effect. Dependent variable here is depression at age 25, based on Swiss data. If you improve cognitive skills and you have a person with low self-esteem, the effect is very little. If you improve cognitive skills with a person with high self-esteem, the relationship becomes very, very strong. So that shows that there is interaction, and it's not possible nor desirable to only speak about non-cognitive or social and emotional skills. We should not make the same mistake as in the past we have only spoken about cognitive skills. Yeah. So we have to look at the broad range of skills that people need to have in order to function well in society, but also to improve society and contribute to social progress. Okay, so that was a little bit for the evidence. If you are interested, look at the books. There is a lot more research out there. But what are now these social and emotional skills I'm talking about? And that's a very important question, also a very difficult question. Because even if I have discussed them now as one group, there are a lot of differences inside this category. I give conscientiousness as just an example to highlight and to inform you a little bit about what do we mean with it. It's also one of the most powerful social and emotional skills that we find in our research. It has 4 subcategories: achievement orientation, self-control, or locus of control, as I mentioned, responsibility, persistence. And you find a short description here. For each of the social emotional skills, we have that kind of explanation. The conscientiousness, as I said, it's actually a very powerful one. And I just want to show this with one last chart. This is showing mortality by age, and the difference between people who are 1 standard deviation higher in measure of conscientiousness and 1 standard deviation lower in 1 measure of conscientiousness. And you see the impact on mortality, the risk that you are dead at that age. And it's quite high. It's a quarter of a standard deviation in survival. So just to, again, convince you, this is really important. It's not something on the fringe. It's also affecting life and death. I think I show this because I found this very powerful and very illustrative. No, I have some more slides and charts. Again, on conscientiousness, this is based not on our own research, but on the way that we find relationships in the literature, different dimensions of conscientiousness and their impact on health. I will not explain that, it would take me too long. But you see that the relationship is always negative. One small exception here for responsibility and unhealthy eating. I might be a very responsible person and have a strong locus of control, I think, but I sometimes eat too much and eat too well. But for the rest, risky driving, drug use, alcohol, risky sex, tobacco, violence, all relate negatively to measures of conscientiousness. Okay, we think after examining a lot of frameworks that the Big Five is still the most powerful framework. I don't know whether people are familiar with the Big Five. It's It comes out of personality psychology, but it has now moved as a concept and as a way of thinking into many other fields. It is shown again and again to me to be the most empirically valid framework with the highest predictive validity. There are other frameworks on social and emotional skills, and maybe in the course of the discussion and research development in the next years, we will have to modify, etc. But we take, for the time being, the Big Five as the best framework that there is out there to understand and measure social and emotional skills. 5 dimensions, if you wish, 5 subcategories of social emotional skills: emotional regulation, and you see some of the descriptions. As I mentioned already, conscientiousness, high predictive validity, agreeableness, openness to experience, and extraversion. So they are not completely mutually exclusive categories, but based on the research that there is, these are the dimensions which are the highest independence from each other. When I speak about social and emotional skills, there is a lot of debate about can they be learned. And it's true, in the beginning of personality psychology work on Big Five, they were seen as personality traits, which are almost given by birth. And still many people believe that. It's a kind of ingrained theory that people have in their minds that your character, your personality is given by birth, it's inherited through your genes, and that it's fixed for life. No, it isn't. I have to disappoint you. That's completely wrong. There is a lot of evidence that the dimensions included in the Big Five can be learned, can be modified. And actually, a lot of, I'm coming back to this at the end, a lot of existing educational traditions and schools and approaches work on personality, work on developing attitudes, work on how people behave, and modifying how you are. You come out of school or university as a different person. It has an impact. You don't only learn cognitive skills, expert knowledge, etc., etc. You become a different person. So it changes your personality. And there is more and more research demonstrating that these dimensions can be changed by learning. Not only formal learning, also experience, life events, targeted interventions outside schools. They cause these skills to change over the life course. And you see some charts here and again, conscientiousness comes out as a very important one because that dimension is most affected by learning. Openness to experience, for example, it has some steep learning curve in young age, but then it seems to be more or less fixed for the rest of the life course. So there are differences in the learnability of social and emotional skills, but that they can be changed, that's for certain. And that should not surprise us. I like this picture very much, because learning is social. Learning is not happening outside of social relationships. How many people believing that technology and MOOCs can be a substitute for learning encounters? Every learning is social. So if learning is social, what you learn has also a social dimension. You also acquire social skills. Another frequently asked question: are they stable across cultures? No, they aren't. There are important cultural differences. But the question is, what's the strength of that argument? I personally, as I said, I am not at all in favor. I'm actually very strong against comparing countries on social emotional skills. We simply don't have the methodology yet to produce reliable indicators. We hope to move that agenda forward. But there are very important differences which make comparison very tricky. But of course, there is a lot of everyday knowledge that we have. We know that some people are more that and other people are more that. Some people are more open, other people are more extrovert, other people are more introvert, etc. So these differences exist between individuals, but also between social groups and between countries. But the constructs, and that's something that you have to believe me on, the research really demonstrates that the constructs can be stable across cultures. It's not because the measures differ between countries that the constructs are not valid across cultures. So there is a lot of research on the cross-cultural validity of these constructs, and it's all looking very promising. Same for the measurement methods. Big Five instruments, and there is an awful lot of literature and research on how to measure Big Five, and they are being applied in a wide range of countries and cultures. Not wide enough. Most of the research which has been at the origin of the Big Five comes from the United States, in some cases increasingly also Europe, but we need much more international approaches, need more international research on the Big Five. But what we know from existing research is that the constructs and the methods seem to behave rather stable in different circumstances. So, very briefly, I will not expand too much, but after this work on social outcomes of learning and social progress, we try to move towards measurement and assessment. And I think one of the big messages for you that I have today is we should not be afraid to embark on a measurement agenda for social and emotional skills. I know this is sensitive. Many people are still very hesitant. But we know, of course, at the OECD very well that unless you move forward the measurement agenda, you are not able to put something on the political agenda. Assessment is what matters. I don't think personally that assessment solves all problems, but assessment is very much needed in order to move forward something and to put it really on the agenda. I personally don't believe that what I described in my early slides about relevance of learning outcomes, that we can move forward on this if we don't have a measurement agenda. So we try to produce that work and to make that forward and to move that forward. So we are now, something you have with animation. Why do we do that? Because we want to expand the focus on what is learning, what are the learning outcomes. Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah. Sorry, I have to move forward again. I switched the wrong button. So expanding the focus on what should be learned in schools. Sorry for that. Okay. Promote also skills development. We want to develop a project which is, again, It's happening automatically.
Oh yeah, it's so
Where are the slides? Can you turn off animation?
I think when it finishes, I'll just.
Let's just switch, not having a. Let's put it this way. Okay. If
Make it big.
if it's fine for you without. Yeah, no.
No. I think maybe it's animated from that slide onwards.
But you cannot switch off the animation.
Yeah.
Oh no, leave it.
Ooh, okay, here we go. That's fine.
No, leave it. Okay. It will come. So we don't want to only do research. We want to also advance our thinking on how to learn and how to teach those skills. So we want to promote the skills development, and we want to improve student outcomes. So our research also has a purpose of improvement, not only for the sake of research itself. So what we want to do, the objectives of this study, and it's now starting to become real. And so we are now actually recruiting countries, and there's quite some interest, not only countries, because we want to work with cities as well. So we have already a significant group of cities and countries who want to do this and who have accepted and are discussing our proposal. So we want to actually assess students at different ages on a range of social and emotional skills. We want to identify the background variables, the contexts that matter for the development of those skills. We want to demonstrate that all this is possible, so we also have some ideas about convincing the international community and policymakers about the relevance of all this, and then to further improve the instruments for next cycles, because our dream is to make this into a longitudinal study and to actually have repeated assessments, partly with the same individuals, partly with different cohorts, so that we can also see the development over time and the factors that impact on the development over time. So assessment, very important, but also we will look into households and what is affecting skills development, skills development factors in schools. We believe that the interaction between these two is very important, not only at home, but also in the local community. We don't think that social and emotional skills development is something that happens only at school. It happens in the interaction between school and households and the local community, background variables, and then the outcomes. We will again look at employability for sure, but also health, interpersonal trust, and a range of other social outcomes. We have developed an assessment approach. I will not go into detail, but we will combine direct assessments, and there are good instruments available, which have been proven to be valid and reliable, with indirect assessments by students and by parents and teachers. And we will triangulate that also with background questionnaires, etc. We have done a lot of work, conceptual work, and there are very interesting background documents and papers on this. If you are interested, we have a very long paper on identifying those skills that we know are measurable culturally, over time, etc., etc. We have been very, very strict in our criteria, both with regard to validity and reliability. But we have identified 19 skills that we are sure of that they work in such a framework. We will come to 15 after field testing. And for the 10-year-old So we will test 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds. We hope to move in the future also to 6, 7-year-olds, but that's the framework for today. And we have, here are the big five. They have different names here, more modern names. And these are the dimensions, sub-dimensions for each of them. We also have what we call, that's a bit tricky to understand, compound skills, where a lot of things come together: critical thinking, metacognition, and self-efficacy. I will not go into detail. A lot of this is based on solid research and on discussions. This is actually the framework that we want to do. I've not included a time frame here, but that's what's going to happen over the next years. So we are actually here somewhere. The design and the preparation is almost finished. We are now recruiting countries. We actually hope, and that's one of the reasons why I was so glad to be here, we hope to have also some non-OECD countries participating. In most of our work in SERI and in education, we try to go beyond the traditional OECD membership. And there is actually a lot of very good reason for emerging and developing countries to do this. I personally believe that, but that's a belief, that's not proven, but that the outcomes on social and emotional skills could be quite different than the learning outcomes assessments for cognitive skills, for developing and emerging economies. And that actually developing countries should take a very good look into the interest of engaging in this kind of work. And we know that there are some countries. Brazil, for example, is extremely interested. And there are several others who are looking into this proposal. So we will then move into the item trialing, the field testing, and then the main study. Probably analysis and reporting will be finished by the end of 21, 22, something like that. So it's actually in the field almost and happening. So just 2 slides with conclusions. I think it's not difficult to understand that social and emotional learning is part of any learning process. That's just very simple, implicitly or explicitly. And as mentioned, many existing educational approaches and any good school will also work on these skills. Will try to influence the social development, but also the personality of students. Social and emotional skills are, I think, essential in understanding and have been neglected far too much in the past in understanding why education has such a big impact, not only on economic measures, but also on social measures and social outcomes. You cannot explain why education has contributed so much to interpersonal trust and to social cohesion if you are not having a framework on social and emotional skills learning. They are hard to measure. So we are not telling you that all this is very easy. We have invested already a lot of time, a lot of money of countries into developing this framework and to produce this proposal. But it is, as I mentioned, very important to develop the assessment agenda, the measurement agenda, both on the technical front, but also on the political front. And we are trying to do both in order to move forward this, what I believe to be a very important agenda. And coming back to my starting point, the SDG framework, I think the concept of relevant learning outcomes, especially in target 4.7, which has this long list of very beautiful, desirable social outcomes, it is absolutely important to identify the social and emotional skills that matter for these things. If you don't do that, you just stick with very cheap political rhetoric. If you are not underpinning 4.7 with hard evidence, this is going to fail. That's my profound conviction. It is not enough anymore to produce beautiful rhetoric. If the SDGs, and especially SDG 4, has to become meaningful, and I truly believe that it has to become meaningful and politically relevant, it has to be supported by data, by evidence, and by a measurement agenda. And I finish here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for this not only clear, but I think very inspiring presentation. I must say that you're a very talented advocate for these kind of skills, but it also, I think, really broadens our perspective on what education systems are supposed to produce, which are learning outcomes, and also how we should engage into a deeper reflection on implementing SDG 4s and achieving results. So really, thank you for that. I'm now going to leave the floor to Carmel, who is going to be a discussant for about 10-15 minutes, right? And then we'll have questions from the room. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. You'll detect a little bit of an Irish accent. We have a tendency to speak very fast, so I will try and slow down. But if I speed up, if you just remind me of that. I'm really grateful for the invitation to be here. I'm actually speaking on behalf of the director of International Bureau for Education, which is a sister body within UNESCO, a sister body of the IIEP, but is very much focused on curriculum design. So I'm coming at this, and you'll see from my slides, I'll be coming at this from that background in curriculum design. I was lucky enough to be responsible for the design of the Northern Ireland curriculum. Not many people have heard about it. That's because we probably didn't do an awful lot of writing about it. We just got on with implementing it. But our curriculum was very much in response to the situation that we found ourselves in a disunited kingdom, going for Brexit, but as a society that was actually embedded in a terrible war for 30, 40 years. And actually the shocking statistic now emerging from at home is that there have now been as many people who have committed suicide in Northern Ireland as were killed in the Troubles. So that's a huge indication of the importance of social and emotional skills. For me, I suppose my interest comes because my interest in skills, first of all, and cognitive skills, comes from being a history teacher in that war-torn society. Can you imagine that I lived and taught up the Falls Road, as they called it, which was just the middle of the war zone, where there was a very separatist Republican agenda that was violent. And I was responsible for teaching children in that situation. So the only way that I could come at the, I suppose, brainwashing or, hugely emotional impact that was going on children's lives was to take a skills-based approach. How does an historian work? They look at the evidence, they look at perspectives, they look at different points of view, they examine the evidence, and they look at things critically. So that's where my big interest in making critical thinking explicit, as Dirk has just said, rather than implicit, making it explicit and going at education from that evidence-based perspective. So that's sort of one of the reasons for my interest. But the second reason was really a realization that no matter how critically you might think, you're also driven by emotions. You're driven by cultural allegiance. It was very funny when I was introduced to Dirk and Hugues at the beginning this afternoon. They said, "Oh, and you're British," and I said, "No, I'm Irish, or should I say, I'm culturally Irish, but maybe I'm politically British." But so it's that sensitivity that we are driven by our emotions, and indeed, what's really fascinating at the moment is that as well as this excellent work that's being embarked on by the OECD, there's such fantastic work going on in terms of neuroscience and the workings of the brain and the huge impact of social and emotional thinking on all of our decisions. So indeed, the aim of the Northern Ireland curriculum is to give children the skills and capabilities to make informed and responsible choices and decisions throughout their lives as individuals for themselves, but as contributors to society and as contributors to the economy and the environment. So I've this huge, passionate, emotional interest, social and emotional and critical thinking interest in all of this area. And we've been doing it now for 10 or so years. We started implementing in 2007, but it's an uphill struggle. We've got the frameworks, we've got the thinking skills, we've got the personal capabilities. But of course, the important thing is it measured? Is it measured? Teachers are interested, but they are driven by measurement. And why are they driven by measurement? Because they are held accountable on the basis of examination results. So I have in here a quote. I've looked it up and I've tried to find the origins of it. It was apparently originally attributed to a French minister of education who said, "One examination is worth 1,000 pieces of curriculum paper." In other words, you can make it statutory, you can show the correlational impact on people's lives, you can see the effect in terms of issues like suicide and obesity and all of these things, but really, have we got an examination in it? And that's why I really welcome the OECD doing this work. Now I have, it's not that I'm a measurement buff, or indeed I would be anti-measurement in many respects, in the sense that I think that the rank ordering within PISA can narrow the agenda to literacy, numeracy and STEM, and has done. That narrows the thinking of politicians, and they all value what we measure. And we value what we measure often because it's easy to measure. But what is brilliant, I think, about this initiative in broadening the agenda is that PISA has very clearly much more strongly come into critical thinking was always there, but very explicitly now. This year, moving into the assessment of global competence. And again, I'll talk about competence and what a challenging word that is, and what is global competence. But excellent that we're now looking at this whole hugely important area of social and emotional skills, so that we will begin to measure what we value. But even though we value it, will it get the prominence that it deserves? So as I'm saying, and I'm using, I stole Dirk's lovely slides and reordered them. IBE welcomes the wider focus, particularly broadening the policy agenda. But I do worry that I don't know what it takes to affect politicians' minds, because this policy agenda has been broadened by employers for a long time. Employers are telling education, yes, of course, send me young people with good qualifications and good critical thinking, but send us people with social and emotional skills. people with leadership, people with ability to get on with other people, to solve problems, to make decisions, but using empathetic and interpersonal skills. So we really welcome the broadening of the agenda, but I wonder just, what will it take to make the difference? And we certainly welcome the promotion of the emphasis on educating the whole child, educating for personal well-being, not as well as school achievement, but educating for employment and job performance, and particularly educating for critical life outcomes, because our life should be balanced. Our life isn't just all study and work. Our lives should be about our relationships, about our leisure, about our inner selves, about our spirituality, about all of these things that are so much more than just school. So yes, I do believe that in focusing on this in a real way, it would improve the SDG targets in terms of improving learning outcomes for everyone, improving outcomes for employment and entrepreneurship, and all of those things about citizenship and diversity and peace, etc., but particularly about our lifestyles. So we also, I think, very much welcome the emphasis on the big 5 domains. And as Dirk has said, this is drawn from their very eclectic research, I think, into all sorts of inventories, personality inventories, etc., that have clear correlational significance. So we can make the argument, as his excellent graphs did, that there are strong correlations between improving social and emotional skills and improving cognition, as well as everything else. What I did here was just name the big 5 and alongside their sort of personality relationships. And I just want to point out a few things. One was about, I just get my handwritten notes here to see where. Yes, the one I didn't mind the change in wording in most of them, but I did dislike intensely the change from conscientiousness to task performance. It sounds so OECD in the terms of sort of mechanistic tasks, because we're talking about much deeper things. We're talking about motivation and responsibility and persistence and all of that. So I did question that one. I don't know whether that's still open for debate. And I also, I suppose, because I didn't have Dirk's explanation, I was wondering where the compound skills came from. But I now realize that, of course, you can't separate cognitive from intra and interpersonal, because it's all going on up here, isn't it? It's all interrelated. And indeed, we can't improve our social and emotional skills if we don't think. So it's I can understand fully. But I was interested in the listing of self-efficacy alongside critical thinking and metacognition. And I wondered, and maybe that's a question for later, why self-efficacy? And is it something that encompasses, because I have to say, and I wonder if she's listening, but my boss, Matt said, Marope, when we were doing our framework for the IBE, she was very much, just as you dislike maybe certain words, she disliked the use of intrapersonal and interpersonal as being maybe heavy and, maybe smacking of hard gardeners and intelligences, etc. So can we find a word that, that captures this without giving that heavy language? But we do know, of course, that when you change the language, you change the constructs, and then you're open to all sorts of debate. So anyway, just to say Therefore, it's all very positive. We very, very much welcome this. And we welcome in particular its alignment with the work that the IBE is doing and also alongside them, the OECD. The IBE, you will know, is older than UNESCO. I have to get that point in. Founded in 1929 and very much linked with great thinkers like Piaget. So it has a great tradition in educational work, and at the moment, alongside the OECD, although not fully in partnership, but hopefully aligning with each other, we're trying to develop frameworks for curricula that not to dictate to any country, but to give countries an idea of what should be there in order to make our curricula much more competence focused, rather than knowledge, just knowledge, but bringing in skills, attitudes, and values. So I've given you here the two definitions that are still a work in progress at the IBE and at the OECD. But it's really about this whole thing of interactively mobilizing not just knowledge, but putting alongside it the skills, values, and attitudes. I would nearly add dispositions, because I want to know how all of those things add up to making us disposed to act or not to act. So you can see that it's all about, the linking up of and making much more explicit the whole skills, values, and attitudes area. And so we see that there is this alignment between knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values, I've said. But I suppose the competence then is bringing all those things together and making them operate in a context. The context can be competence within a discipline, which is what people generally see it to be. So how good a mathematician are you? How good an historian are you? How good a scientist are you? But we're also really wanting to focus on the need for greater interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, because today's problems don't get solved by one subject. They get solved by people thinking together, and they also must get solved in a way where we're thinking critically and deeply and thinking creatively about the issues that we have to face, and applying those in our personal lives, but also in our attitudes to sustainability, to citizenship, to global issues. So it's all going on, folks. All of those stars would sort of come together into a cog, and this wheel will be turning. The problem is just trying to get some conceptual clarity in it, because people are using skill. I could nearly use the words social and emotional competence if I was to take the skills that we have and apply it to certain knowledge areas. So we have to weigh up, does it need to be a competence in order for it to be taken seriously? And you'll see here, it's within the competence frameworks that are emerging from IBE and from the OECD, you'll see a big focus on social and emotional skills for the IBE within lifelong learning. Here's one that I'll be debating with Dirk later. The director, Dr. Moussy, very much has gone for this word self-agency. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's self-efficacy, but also applying it in terms of an agency, that empowerment for self-fulfilling and socially fulfilling and economically fulfilling and environmentally fulfilling action. And also the social skills of interacting with others and interacting in and with the world. So you can see that it's very much in there and being highlighted within these emerging competence frameworks. And so finally, I'm just going to end with a few questions that I had just to stimulate your questions, but mine, you can see, are probably very much coming from this conceptual desire for conceptual clarity. Let's know what we're talking about here. So if you look at the, sorry, I've gone. Am I showing the? I'm showing the OECD framework. Shouldn't be. So as we know, the empirical basis for this comes from personality behavior traits. Now, are those personality behavior traits? So are these all skills and are they all learnable? Are some of them attitudes and dispositions that derive from us developing the skills? For example, is motivation a skill? Is optimism a skill? Is energy a skill? Is trust a skill? I think no, they're not skills. I think they're more attitudes or dispositions that emerge from the thinking that goes on. There's two things mentioned here: self-control and emotional control. Well, I would have thought if you're self-controlled, you're emotionally controlled. So there's an overlap there. So I know that Dirk, in an earlier slide, was wanting to reduce them. There are 19 skills named here, to reduce them to 15 for 15-year-olds and to less 10 or 12 for 10-year-olds. So there's a way, I think, of maybe looking at which are more attitudes than learnable skills. Dirk has already explained where the compound skill comes from. And I've already asked a question about self-efficacy. Is it more important than anything else, or might self-agency cover some of this? But I would like, I think, for the OECD and the IBE very much to look at this whole business of the link up between knowledge and skills, attitudes, values, and dispositions, and how that, clarify all of that so that we know what we're talking about when we're talking about critical competence. And I suppose towards the end here, are they primarily caught through practice and pedagogy? And that's the danger. Oh yes, we'll just change the pedagogy and kids will absorb these by osmosis. No, they need to be made explicit. Employers are naming them explicitly. So we need to identify them explicitly, but also I'm asking, is there an important body of knowledge? For example, in Northern Ireland, we have an area of the curriculum for the last 10 years called Learning for Life and Work. And it involves personal development, including things like relationships and sexuality, citizenship and employability skills, which would have involved a lot of these social and emotional skills. So is there a body of knowledge that you add to the implicit sort of interactive skill that makes it a competence? And certainly, I've become fascinated myself. I'm a great YouTube fan. I've become a great meditator online, get wonderful things to listen to. But there's a fantastic work being done by Dr. Dan Siegel on interpersonal neurobiology. So it's this whole emergence of, the sciences all combining to understand the mind and the place of social and emotional skills. So although I'm not suggesting that we maybe put psychology and neuroscience into the curriculum, but I am suggesting we put in personal development, citizenship and employability. And I am suggesting that we take mindfulness as a practice seriously. And you see schools are now doing that and creating children who are much more thoughtful, self-assured. And finally, I hadn't thought of it until really today. I haven't got it on my slide, but I did suggest to Dirk that maybe it would be important to assess or at least survey teachers' attitudes to social and emotional learning. Because, for example, within TALIS, because really I think you will find that teachers, because of their relational empathy for children, will care greatly about social and emotional skills. And if they are in favour, can we take it much more seriously? But what are the impediments? If it's still the soft side, and if it's still only pedagogy, it may not make it, to the plate. But if we do think about that important body of knowledge that children need about their own brains, their lives, their sexuality, their relationships, their diet, nutrition, physiology, all of these things, then I think we might take it more seriously and have a happier world, and hopefully a more successful one. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Thank you very much, Carmel, for this very well constructed response. There are a few questions that you raise or you ask at the end. So I don't know, Dirk, if you would like to take a few minutes to respond to a few of these questions, and then we will open the floor to the room.
Yeah, well, very briefly, because I think we agree on 99%, and to spend the rest of the afternoon on just discussing the 1% is not very effective. But thank you so much, Carmel, for very insightful comments. There are 2 points to which I would like to react very briefly. The point on terminology and language, I think, is very important. I'm not going to enter into the debate on specific terms. I personally like your criticism of moving from conscientiousness to task orientation. But yeah, these changes in terminology have been made on solid grounds and after long discussion. So it's not up to me just here on the spot to say, no, we will change again. But I think I take your point that language and terminology and such an emerging field of research and policy and practice is very powerful. And we should look at this very, very carefully and try to see consensus and agreement in among as much as communities and stakeholders as possible. Secondly, and finally, I very much like your point about teachers. And I think it's incredibly important. It's always in the back of our mind. Of course, we can't do everything. We want to move the assessment and measurement agenda forward. But there is always in the back of our mind, we should also look into pedagogy, into teaching, into pedagogical approaches and etc. And to make that link to Thales is certainly something that we have already thought about, and we will move that forward in the next phase. By the way, I forgot to tell you that this project, of course, is leading the whole development in the OECD Education Directorate on social and emotional skills, but it also becomes manifest in other fields of work. So you mentioned also global competence in PISA, which is now actually in the field in 2018. Very important, innovative domain and experiment actually. Social emotional skills will also be an optional module in PIAC 2021. So the new assessment on adult learning will also include measures on social and emotional skills. And we want to expand that and to, of course, make as many connections as possible between the different surveys and data collections that we have. But I'll stop here and thank you again. Very insightful.
Thank you. So we have about 35 minutes for discussion. And so if you have questions or comments, please try to make them a little bit short so we have time to have a response. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Henry Sapaiti. I'm the first Secretary for Education at the Embassy and Permanent Delegation of Zambia to UNESCO. If I understood the presentation very well, somewhere around the 21 or 22, that's when you'll be evaluating. And we will have something like 8 years before 2030. So I just wanted to learn how you intend to move from there, perhaps to ensure that the results of the project help member states. And then maybe the other thing is that I heard that we are registering countries into this project. I just wanted to learn how countries can express their interest.
Yeah. Your first question is a very good one. As you know, there is an intensive, and I think SDG 4 is actually leading in the whole SDG development. But there is a whole measurement and data collection agenda supporting the different targets of SDG 4. And a lot of work is now being done also with the OECD, using our data, but also complementing them with other data and new assessments, etc., etc. But we have to be realistic. I don't think that on this field and with social and emotional skills, we will have anything like a global kind of assessment of social emotional learning, which is capable of underpinning 4.1 or 4.7 from this perspective. That's simply not realistic. And it would lead to very harmful developments if we would exaggerate in speeding up the development. These things take time. You have to be very careful in the research development, research planning. You also have to be inclusive in the community you build around this work, with stakeholders, with countries, with policymakers. So these things take time. What we aim to do is to simply put the measurement agenda front and center in this debate and say, look, this is a very important part of learning. It is implicitly there in the SDG 4. Let's move forward with developing the assessment agenda, but let's do it seriously and not hasty. The second question, for non-OECD members, please contact us directly via me or via anyone in the Education and Skills Directorate, and then we can have a discussion and see how we can move forward. But we would, as I mentioned at the end, we would really love to have also some non-OECD member countries engaging in this discussion because, well, in education in general, I hate the distinction between rich and poor or between developed and developing. And especially in the field of social and emotional learning, I personally believe, but that's just a personal conviction, that developing countries actually have a lot to demonstrate and a lot to learn to the rest of the world, which have maybe more experience in formal, cognitively focused education, whereas learning in communities, learning out of schools, learning in the streets is maybe very powerful in some of the other countries. So we can have a very fruitful and powerful debate if we are also engaging non-OECD members in this development.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Yeah, please. Oh,
Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And let me thank the presenters for the wonderful presentation. And let me also thank IIEP for kicking up this debate, which is very crucial for the statutory agenda. My name is George Londia. I'm the ambassador of Kenya to UNESCO. I'm myself an educationist, and I take a keen interest in educational matters. I think you have quite highlighted a lot of the key issues, but the focus to me has been more on what you call the formal aspects of schooling. But when you are looking at the emotional development, a school is just one socializing agent in terms of this emotional and social development. And like Carmel has said, the non-formal aspects of schooling also constitutes some of the learning spaces, because they do indeed have an impact on the emotional and social development, and they need to be reinforced. One would be the family, for example, is one primary socializing agent that has a big impact in emotional, social and emotional development. So if a school does not take into cognizance the impact of the nature of the family, because the family can reinforce what the school is setting to do or can delimit. Late in Africa, even I think globally, the internet, social media is beginning to have a big impact on social and emotional development of children. We tell people, when you see your child locking themselves in a room on the computer or getting very emotional, sometimes they are very happy and then suddenly they are down. It's not the school. It is these new aspects that have come. So it's important that as you continue that study, you begin to look at these other indicators that do have a strong impact on the emotional and the social development of children. And I also welcome your idea that Africa has a lot to contribute in terms of best practices and learning experiences on how we are handling these issues. Thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe we'll take a round of 2 or 3 questions and then group them for the response. Anton?
Thanks. I'm Anton Dirk, head of Technical Cooperation at IIEP. I thought it very, very interesting presentations and on an extremely important topic. And as has been said already a little bit, there are maybe some mega trends now which actually make it more difficult to pay attention to this. There's all this issue of measurement, and unfortunately, much of this measurement is simplifying for all sorts of reasons we know, and maybe also the whole risk of loss of status of teachers, loss of professionalism of teachers, and so on, which again will have an impact on this. And I have 2 concrete questions actually, to which I'm a bit afraid the answer may well be no, but if not, so much the better. The first question would be, are there any education systems who at the moment in their student assessment processes, but student assessment processes which have some importance for student career, already pay attention to these social and emotional skills? Either as part of examinations, if ever that is possible, or maybe as part of any other form of assessment. Second question, do we know anything about the social and emotional skills of teachers? Have they changed over time? Because there is a discourse that maybe teachers have become less professional and all that sort of thing. And do we know anything about the relationship between the social and emotional skills of teachers and that of the students they teach? Though I fully take the point that much of this will be done outside of the school system and even beyond the age of 18 or 25, as your very interesting graphs have shown. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Dirk. I'm from the Moussy of Mauritius.
Microphone needs to be turned up. Can you turn up?
You have to keep it close, I think.
Yeah. My name is Dirk. I'm from the Embassy of Mauritius. I would just like to take the cue from the 2 previous speakers. I think the international economic model is a good impact factor, because the way the media, the big corporations are shaping our lifestyle, less communication. The ambassador of Kenya has taken it that we spend a lot of time on our computers, etc. There's less interaction, interpersonal contact. You rely on, it's a world that is going towards robotization in every aspect of life, and less of human interaction. So I'm definitely convinced about the soft skills, about the non-cognitive skills that we need to push ahead. But we've got other impact factors that permeate our life from morning to afternoon, year after year, day in, day out. And it will be truly, in my view, a fight against time, a fight against technology, and a fight against the political evils. Thank you.
Yeah, three very interesting and challenging questions. I'll try to give some brief answers, and then maybe Carmel, you also want to intervene. First, Mr. Ambassador, I agree 200%. So maybe you have seen in my short description of the design of the study, we want to look at three areas or environments which have an impact on social and emotional skills development of 10-year and 15-year-olds, which is the school, the family, and the local community. And we will triangulate also between the three, and to see how a child or young person or an adult who is in these three environments, where and how he or she develops the social and emotional skills we are talking about. Are there any conflicts? Are there any etc.? So that's very at the heart of our study. Of course, we work to some extent for the educational system, and we are also financed and governed by education ministries. So the formal education system is a very important player in our community and in our study design. Schools are, let me say, a kind of powerful and concentrated socialization agent, to use your words, whereas the non-formal and informal learning environments are less explicit, less powerful, less concentrated, less professionalized, of course, etc. So schools do probably also play a very important role, but we want to find out in comparison with households, families, and local communities. And I think the different impact of the three can be different in different cultures and communities. And I take your point that in Africa, community learning is probably, but actually we have not very good data on this, but it's probably very important, especially since so many children are out of school, and that people have to develop life skills, which is another very interesting concept, by the way, in other environments. Just on the matter of terminology, you will not have heard me using soft skills, and that's absolutely on purpose. I would like to bend the word. Soft skills, there is nothing soft about this, and there is nothing hard about cognitive skills. I simply don't understand analytically the difference between hard and soft. So I would like to abandon this this concept. Non-cognitive, sometimes you are forced to use it, but I don't like it. But social and emotional skills is now used as a container concept. But I think over the years, when we have better evidence and much more analytical approaches to these questions, we will see the vocabulary and terminology also moving forward. That's my conviction. So, but it is important which labels you use to address these issues. And I forgot your question now.
Yeah, about assessment.
Yeah. You can maybe. I had a few thoughts, but I can maybe share them after you.
You were asking about, is there anywhere where there are good examples?
Oh, yeah.
So there are brilliant examples in higher education, because young people work together on collaborative problem solving and collective presentation. They work at university the way that they work that they're expected to work when they go into industry. Or so why can't we have that at school? I had the privilege of going to the United States in 1999, and I visited a number of schools in Austin, Texas. And they had this brilliant arrangement whereby they had 6 high schools, but each, and while they taught the range of educational content, each one had one specialism. One was a technology college that worked with Silicon Valley. Another was linked to Young Farmers of America. Another was into the arts and drama. And to give you some examples of their final assessment, their final assessment end of school year was that the young people set up a pod of working together, a collaborative group. They decided on a project. They were given $500 and a room. And they were assessed at the end of the year by a jury or an assessment panel of their teachers and their peers. And their teachers were there to mentor them in terms of what they needed for the project. So one project, that's technology one, was building a solar-powered boat. The arts and drama one was putting on a production. And the Young Farmers of America actually reared the cattle and reared the animals and brought them to market and sold them for a profit. It was a fantastic collaborative learning. And now that is 20 years ago, I saw that. It's that business about value what we assess because it's easy to assess, because you do it in pen and paper. Imagine pen and paper as well. Young people, I don't know how they actually manage to write, because my son, who is now nearly 28, said to me when he was 6, well, why am I being taught to write when I need to be taught to type? So, and yet we put them in examination halls to write. So there has to be a breakthrough in assessment. We have one wonderful assessment called Moving Image Arts, and it came from a link with the film industry, and that's why we've got Game of Thrones and all these things are now filming in Northern Ireland, because we put in an examination on moving image arts where young people collaborate to make films and to learn all the skills. So until we that's why I care so much. I hate assessment, but I also love it. If it would just, waken up and open up. In Australia, I think it's Queensland, and certainly in Canberra, they have things called the questionless question, which is simply, here's the data, what does it tell you? Here's the data, what's the problem? Here's the data, where's the solution? So we just have to, I think, I just look forward. I don't think it'll be in my lifetime, but I look forward to a revolution in assessment. And if I could just talk about the horrendous United Kingdom for 1 second. At a time when universities are doing modular courses and having young people collaboratively assessed, the Secretary of State for Education got rid of all modular examinations so that children are assessed after 2 years. Now, what does that say about focus, persistence, and, so assessment is a problem, but assessment is also the solution. Just to say something very positive, I had the privilege of critiquing the new Kenyan curriculum. So, and I was very impressed with some of the things that it was doing. I totally agree that it's family, but it's hugely also the impact of peers. It's hugely the impact of peers. So until we make these social and emotional skills explicit in programs, in schools, so that young people can critique what is going on in terms of social media and bullying and pressure and all these things, and develop the wherewithal to, to keep themselves safe. And finally, on the teacher competences, or on the role of teachers, it's hugely important that teachers see their relationship with children and their pedagogy as, you know, as fundamental, and therefore IBE has been cooperating with, there's a whole movement coming out of Africa, and the meeting was in Togo on a competence framework for teachers for the world. And I think that really social and emotional skills need to be strongly there and strongly in teacher training programs.
Yeah. On your question, I have a bit of a different view than you.
It's okay.
In 2015, we did a small survey in the context of Skills for Social Progress work, and we were actually quite surprised to find that both at the national level, in national curriculum frameworks, there was quite some significant evidence about the availability of assessment instruments and approaches, etc. We also collected fragmentary evidence from schools who use different assessment methods to evaluate social and emotional skills, scorecards, etc., qualitative assessments used by teachers, etc. I don't think we can say that social and emotional learning is absent from assessment in schools. But I think it's on the decline. When I was raised in a rather traditional school in the Flemish community in Belgium, I was assessed on my behavior very strictly. And you know that situation. And I think that was the case in many countries. And over the years, this has disappeared from assessment practices in schools and classrooms because legal, on what basis is the teacher making this judgment, and if this has implications for awarding a degree or a certificate, what is the legal basis, etc. So teachers and schools have become afraid from legal difficulties and have moved away from assessing these kind of things. There has also been some tendency in schools, and this all sounds rather conservative, but to that behavior of students is actually something that they should not really concentrate on. That what matters is the curriculum learning and what's explicit in the curriculum, etc. So. And it's, of course, true that assessing social and emotional skills can be very controversial and can be very even conservative. Some people accuse this thinking and this debate and this development in the OECD. Yeah, you want to make ideal, almost robotic children who behave well and who are obedient and etc. Yes, of course, there is some idea about the ideal person in this, and this should always be questioned, and this should always be in the debate. There is a normative element in the Big Five, but I also think, and that is partly an answer to the third question, that there is an element of resilience in this. Why I think this is important ultimately has to do with the fact that I believe that we have to make children and young people resilient and capable of confronting different difficulties in their life and also adverse situations, including social media, including the power of the big powers over their lives. So it is, for me, this is an agenda of empowerment. For me, this is not about creating, in a very conservative way, the ideal citizen of the future. But of course, there is a normative element. I do believe in citizens who are actively engaged in their communities, who participate politically, who have strong communication skills, who are effective in dealing with others, who have a lot of empathy, etc. This is a normative view of what human beings should be. But it's also true that this can be turned into a very conservative agenda. So let's say the ethical dimension in this debate is very, very important. But I do believe that schools would make a mistake if they would refrain from this agenda because they think that society is not entrusting them with developing these capabilities.
Yes, we'll take another round of questions, and I have a few questions coming from people online, so I'll try to take one too.
Behind you.
Thank you very much. I'm just giving my experience way back from Uganda. My name is Dorothy. I'm from Uganda. My observation is that we don't have to do away with the parents in this learning process. Back at home, we normally have such programs. I'm learning. I'm doing a program of advanced ATPA. I'm training with IIEP, advanced training program, which is taking place right now for 6 months. In Uganda, we have such programs whereby it's a bit informal, but it's handling the formal students. During the holidays, children are gathered together. They're taken to a different place for about 3 weeks, all ages from basic education to upper secondary. And they are equipped with these skills, all types of skills, emotional, critical thinking, plus also tangible skills, the drama, the carpentry, okay, just basics of the tangible skills. So they're equipped with these skills, but they're divided into various groups according to ages, maybe from like 5 to 10, like that. So they get professionally trained people to come and give these skills, like maybe communication skills, whatever. Then after the training program, these kids are given a certificate. In case after their graduation, they will have this emotional skills certificate plus the academic skills certificate, which will show to their employers that I have 2 types of certificates. From there, after these programs, by the end of the program, the parents are invited after 2 weeks to come and do an evaluation of what is taking place at home. So they compare and evaluate these programs, and maybe they make changes to the next term that we shall adjust on this. So they will have various things that they will equip these kids with. So what am I going to? I think we have to include the non-formal trainings of these programs, and we join together with the formal trainings, because we can't give out at home. This is where these skills begin from. Social skills start from home. I don't know how you can take these scenarios and add them to your research, if it will be of help. Thank you very much.
If there is any, I'll just take one more question from the room because we only have 5 minutes left, and you can ask a question in French. Actually, I didn't say that. And if there not, which is the case, there are a few. There have been a few questions from people following us online, and a lot of them, or most of them, really deal with the issue of cultural adaptations to these kind of skills, either the sub-skills that you have here or the major big 5 skills that you have presented, and whether the survey questionnaire, the methodologies that you're going to use is going to adapt these kind of skills to different countries, or if you just want to adapt the questionnaire to assess these skills in the different countries. So whether it's really transferable and translatable from a country or a cultural area to another.
Yeah, let me first briefly answer your question, but I don't have to say a lot because I agree. There are actually a lot of interesting examples like the one you mentioned of non-formal interventions into developing social and emotional learning inside schools or parallel to schools or outside schools or in youth movements or whatever. So, and these are very important. It's not yet into the framework of our study to examine these interventions or these practices. We hope at some point in time to come to some ideas about what are the powerful best practices for stimulating the development of social and emotional skills, both in schools and families, or in family support systems, or in community learning, or whatsoever. So it's in our mind, but more in the medium term to have some ideas. But you're right. You have to look at these interventions and practices to have a complete picture. On the cultural adaptability, this is a very almost emotional debate. Our point at this time is, but maybe we have to change that in the course of the development of the project, is, as I said, that the constructs and the methodology is robust enough to be used in different cultural environments. So we are not thinking of adapting the instruments yet, but we will field test them. And maybe we will have to draw conclusions from the field tests. Can be very simple conclusions, referring to the language, like we do in PISA. We also PISA test, field test the PISA items, and there are sometimes items which have to be deleted. Actually, in PISA, a lot of the items are dropped, which have been initially developed because they do not behave in the same way in different cultural or linguistic environments, and that's quite rigorous, that process. And of course, we will be confronted with the same questions, with the same issues. Not all questions in our instruments will behave in the same way in different cultural contexts. But we will not do a priori something based on the assumption that these things are not measurable in the same way in different cultural environments. But this is actually not a principal question, it's an empirical question. If the evidence is there that some things do not behave well in different cultural circumstances, we have to adjust our instruments. I hope this is more or less an answer to that question.
I think it is,
from people online.
Well, it's 6, so we have to stop here. Dirk and Carmel, I would really like to thank you for this very insightful presentation, response, for this inspiring debate that we had. And I think there's a lot to do all together between IBE and OECD, IEP, and a lot of our other partners. So thank you again. Thank you for all the followers, online followers, a lot of them, I think. Thank you for being here tonight. Oh. Oh, I just don't have the title, but.
That's okay. Thanks. Please join us on March 12th when Simon Marginson, who is the professor at the Center of Global Higher Education at University of Cambridge or University of London, UCL, will be joining us, and we're going to turn our attention to higher education and different aspects of learning, and thinking about how higher education can be considered as a global good. So March 12th. Thank you very much, everyone, and it's up to Hugues. You're the Frenchman here. Invite us to the cocktail.
Oh, okay. So I invite you to the boat, which is just well, follow everyone. you will find it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to all the online audience members.
That's the online audience.
Thanks. Thank you. Helemaal bedankt. Wat een bijzonder,
They're already
bijzonder
shared on
interessant.
Twitter.
Bijzonder interessant. Helemaal bedankt.
Can you talk to the comments?
Thank you, madam. As I have been a history teacher myself, all at the beginning of my career, I feel a lot of sympathy for all. It was good. It's a very interesting debate. It's a very important debate. Very important debate. And I think indeed for many of the systems we work with, teachers